Morning to everybody. As Byron said, my name is Herman Enoch. I'm going to walk you through Workman's Compensation today. So just a very quick background of myself. I used to work for a company called FEM. We did the Workman's Compensation for the construction industry. That's for Class 5, the category Class 5. So there would be a lot of you that are registered under Class 5, and you could either belong to FEM or belong to the compensation fund. Okay, we currently do workman's compensation in our new capacity. We have a company called Utopia Consulting. You'll see it at the bottom right of your screen. And we now do the workman's compensation on behalf of the government. So if you're registered with government, that's where we work. So moving on in the presentation. Okay, so we're going to start with the absolute basics, just to cover what exactly is workman's compensation. So the best way to describe workman's compensation is to call it a social assurance. And a social assurance being an assurance that the easiest way to understand it is they look for excuses to pay. So the workman's compensation itself, it pays for individuals for the days that they lost due to a workplace injury. It could be a severe illness, and it can also be death. So in the case of death, they'll pay a lump sum benefit, or in the case of work days that are lost, they will compensate for the work days lost. There's also lump sums paid to dependents in the event of a death, and they call a monthly pension. And when it comes to disabilities, they would work on the degree of disability, and these are all medical terms. Now, if that degree of disability is less than 30%, for example, they'll pay a lump sum benefit to the individual. I'd like to clear up right up front that there's a misconception with workman's compensation that individuals are going to become very wealthy if they get injured, and that's not true at all. In terms of what they actually pay, they pay 75% of the income, and the reason they pay 75% of the income is it makes no sense to have an individual sitting at home receiving their full income. There's no incentive for them to get back to work. So, and it only kicks in after day 3. So they're quite strict in terms of the rules and how they pay, and they ensure that individuals are not enriched through workman's compensation. Apart from that, there's a lot of service providers that provide services when somebody is injured, and a service provider could be from an ambulance transporting an injured worker to a hospital that performs the operations on individuals. Then you can go on to doctors, the surgeons, and all of these service providers are paid at a specific rate. It works like the medical aid. They have ICD-10 codes, and they paid depending on the work they've done. So when claims are submitted, for example, there's claims assessors that look at the injury and they look at the type of service provided. A common question we come across is, do I have to take out workman's compensation? There's no two ways about this. This is a compulsory assurance, and it should be taken out by every single employer, every single company, irrespective of the type of work they do. You would have it from accountants to any service provider. They will have to take out workman's compensation. And then failure to register for workman's compensation is indeed a breach of the COID Act, and there can be legal action that's enforced. Sorry, I'm just struggling to change my screen. There we go. So What exactly does Workman's Compensation pay for? It pays for the days lost to a workplace injury. It pays for severe illnesses. And an example of a severe illness could be like noise-induced hearing loss, or it could be, if mining, it could be any lung diseases. Those could be severe. So they're long-term illnesses. And of course, it pays for the death of the employee. And again, I covered this earlier, it pays only after 3 days. So it will backdate to day one, but it only kicks in as a workplace injury after day three. Um, it only pays for an injury for the work the individual was employed to do. Now, this is a very, very important point. So I've put a little example in there. You could see that a painter who moves a forklift, a person employed as a painter, and then he decides, okay, wants to move a forklift and he's injured. While moving the forklift will not be compensated. So how Workman's Compensation looks at this is they look at the type of work that he is employed to do, and if the injury does not match that type of work, then they will reject that particular claim. Now, the reverse to that is if that painter was given an instruction by the employer. In that specific case, because it was an instruction, that painter will be compensated. So there's a lot of investigation that goes into claims. I know that when people submit claims, they expect immediate payment, but behind the scenes, there's individuals working on these claims to make sure that it is a valid claim. And then if we go into a little more detail into how Workman's Compensation pays, so they will pay either a monthly pension or a lump sum benefit depending on the dependents. And I touched on this earlier again, looking at the degrees of disability. So if, for example, the disability itself was much higher, if it was more than 30%, then that individual will get paid a salary, and that salary again will be at 75% of the current salary. Then all of the medical costs, such as the doctor, surgeon, the hospital invoices, they compensated. So they paid in full. So this is where it works like a medical aid, for lack of a better word, where all the service providers are paid. Right. Now, another common question we have is, can my company deduct contributions from my salary? So it is a practice out there. There are employers that do this, and we'd just like to state that it is actually illegal for an employer to deduct contributions for workman's compensation. Workman's compensation is calculated on a percentage depending on the risk of the work that's being performed, and that is a percentage of the payroll. So they do not look at individuals per se when they're calculating. They look at the company in its entirety, and those premiums should be paid over once a year to the compensation fund. As mentioned, the employers are not allowed to deduct from employers are not allowed to deduct from employees. Right, when we look at the calculation of the premium, how do they actually calculate those premiums that need to be paid? So they calculate it based on the risk rating according to the type of work an employer does. And then they charge a percentage of the total company payroll as an annual premium. So I've just taken one example. If an employer, for example, is in food retail, so this is called Class C, it's subclass 1511. The compensation fund is currently working to reduce, they have a lot of classes currently, and they're reducing that to just a few classes. So they're going to reduce it over the next couple of years. They've already started this. And that particular subclass 1511, would pay a rate of 86 cents for every 100 Rand of payroll. So they work as percentages, which will be 0.86% of the total payroll. So if their payroll, in this particular example, I used very small figures. If their payroll is 200,000 for the year, this means these are all the salaries they pay their employees. The Workman's Compensation premium will be simply 200,000 Rand times the 0.86, which is the rate, and that will give them a premium of 1,720 Rand per annum. What is interesting is that 1,720 Rand is kind of an open checkbook. All of the employees are covered for unlimited medical expenses. That's one way of looking at workman's compensation. Again, going right back to the initial, what is workman's compensation? That's why we say it's a social assurance. And they really do look for reasons to pay, unlike traditional insurers, and I hope there's nobody from traditional insurance companies here, where they will look for every excuse not to pay a claim. And this is, I'm talking about your short-term assurance and your life assurance. Right, what happens when you pay your premium? You are issued with what is called a letter of good standing, or logs for short. And a letter of good standing is a document issued by the compensation fund after assessing the employer and receiving the required premium. So once they've done all their calculations, they will send you an invoice. Once you've transferred the money, all of this happens electronically. You will be issued with a letter of good standing. So the letter of good standing simply confirms that the employee is fully paid up and is in good standing with the compensation fund, hence the name. Once the company has a letter of good standing, the employees are covered for workplace injuries. Just a little side note. So employees, if an employer fails to pay the annual levies, the employees are still covered. You cannot deny an employee medical treatment. What happens in cases like that there is that the Department of Labor will investigate the company and they can issue fines. So they have a lot of legislation where they can issue fines, and this can even lead to imprisonment. So your 16.1s, your 16.2s, on your 8.2s, they do play a very vital role, and they can be held accountable if they do not pay premiums or for any fraudulent transactions as well. Without a valid letter of good standing, a company cannot carry on their operations. This is very common. You see this on construction work sites. If there's subcontractors that come through, they do not have a valid letter of good standing, they're not allowed to continue work, or they get kicked off site. The same works for main contractors. Clients, they demand a letter of good standing. If those files are not up to date, they cannot. They also cannot tender, because this is one of the most important documents in the tender process in terms of the letter of good standing. There's also a variety of checks that can be performed on letters of good standing with any private institute, and by private institute we mentioned FEM, and with government. So their systems are set up to try and find fraudulent letters of good standing. And this is also a common practice, to try and issue fraudulent letters. Right, so I thought I'll talk a little bit about the claims process, because this is something that we see a lot, where companies don't have any joy with claims, and then they go on to start blaming the compensation fund and systems. So there is a very rigid process when it comes to claiming. For example, on any claim, you would require the following documentation. If we look at number 1 there, they have what they traditionally call the WCL2. That's the Employer's Report of Accident form. This is one of the most important forms, because this details the accident. Something that we see a lot of is this is completed half-heartedly, it's not completed, there's missing sections. Every line on that employer's report of accident needs to be completed. If there's missing information, you will find that claims get rejected immediately. Now, along with the employer's report of accident, where a lot of employers don't do is get the first medical report. Now, this is the WCL4 form. The first medical report is normally filled in by a service provider. So it could be whoever's issuing the treatment. So the doctor that is treating, or the treating doctor or surgeon, will have to fill out the first medical report and supply that together with the employer's report of accident, which is collated and sent to Workman's Compensation. Then we also need the ID copy of the injured employee, and then the current payslip of the injured employee. Now, just to mention out there, when the payslip is requested, a lot of times individuals feel immedately that they're going to get paid. This is not the case. Once the assessor goes through the claim, the reason to have the payslip there is to do any calculations, and if they pay according to that payslip. So whatever the injury is, they will request a payslip upfront so that they can perform any calculations. Once all these documents are in place, it has to be uploaded onto, so the Department of Labor has the CompEasy system. I'm sure many of you have come across the CompEasy system, and then you have to get a claim number. Once you get that claim number, then the service providers can start providing all these services. So what this simply means is if there's an injury and that injury needs further treatment, normally a service provider is going to say no, because they immediately think that they're not going to get paid. But once we have the claim number and we take that claim number, then we submit the claims on behalf of the service providers to ensure that they get paid. So just a note for all of you, in terms of the service provider payments, the government systems are extremely good in terms of CompEasy. Most service providers know how to submit their claims, and payments done relatively quickly. And the third part of this whole process is you've got to supply all the required documentation for finalization of a claim. It's extremely important to finalize claims and not leave claims open or just sitting on the system. Another thing we see a lot of is there's a lot of third-party service providers who go out, they want to assist companies, and the only thing they do is they register the claim and then the process stops there. That is not very good, and I've just gone over a few pointers as to why it is important to actually finalize claims and not just have them registered. So number one, it's illegal not to register any claims, and employees have 7 days after an incident to inform the DOL of their injury. Sorry, that should have been employers. So what happens if you don't report after 7 days? And this could happen where somebody gets injured, but it only manifests 2 weeks later. So they just ask for a little affidavit. You will fill in all the normal documentation that we just went through, an affidavit stating why this case was reported late, and that's submitted on the CompEasy system as well. Right. Leaving claims open and not finalized, it leaves a company open to fraud. And why we say this is, unfortunately, we do have unscrupulous medical service providers. We do have guys that know the system. So it's kind of leaving an open checkbook with somebody. And this could be an employee or a service provider, or employees could work together with service providers to defraud the compensation fund. What this actually does is it's defrauding the company as well, because as your claims increase, you can be faced with a loading on your premiums. And a loading is simply the rates that we discussed earlier. For example, in the case was 0.86%. If they were to load 100%, that doubles up. that will be about 1.7%. So instead of you paying 1,700 rand, you'll find that you have to pay 3,400 rand, for example. That's a loading. And these are small numbers. You have companies that would pay millions. And if you get loaded on millions, you're doubling up those claims. So it has a lot of consequences. Also, if employees leave the employee of one company and go to another and there's an open claim, they can still claim on that claim. That claim is open in perpetuity. So it is extremely important to have claims finalized. And that's, I think, as a service provider ourselves, our core focus is not just registering claims, it's more to finalize. And then non-submission of claims is punishable by a fine or imprisonment or both, and this is found in the COIDA Act. So it's in everybody's best interest to actively work on claims. Right. In conclusion, say injuries are costly and they could easily bankrupt small businesses. We do unfortunately see that as well, where the costs of injuries become so high, and if employees are not registered, in many instances, these would come directly to the employer to settle on. We find that people also use medical aids when it comes to workplace injuries, and this, although it's fine to do that, and people want to get the best possible medical care, it's not fair to the medical aid themselves, because if it is a workplace injury, it should be paid by the compensation fund. So one of the other things that we do is we compensate the medical aid. So if it's paid for, then we go in and we would register it as a workman's compensation claim, and then those funds are paid directly to the medical aid. So if you're using your medical aid, it actually reimburses you on your medical aid. So if you had savings, for example, it'll reimburse all that savings that you'd used. And the doctors themselves are still paid. So nobody else plays in that space. It's just the medical aid and workman's compensation. So workman's compensation does cover all medical costs for a very small contribution. So it's a very cheap, it's a very affordable assurance, and it ensures that your employees are adequately covered. And then failure to correctly implement workman's compensation can result again in a fine or prison sentence. It's extremely important to understand this point, because the liable person ultimately becomes the 16.1 or the 16.2. There have been legal cases where the workmen's compensation themselves would take a company to task. The other thing to understand is that employees have access to the compensation fund. So when employees feel that employers have not taken care of them, they would go directly to the compensation fund to complain to the fund themselves. And then just a side note, I mean, we touched on the registration and the finalization of claims. It's important that if you're using service providers to assist with workman's compensation, that they understand the process and that they experienced with workman's compensation matters, and that they assist you to get your claims finalized. And I think I've reached my time limit, and I'd just like to say thank you. Thank you to Byron and team for allowing me on this platform. Yeah, we can open for a few questions if there's any questions.
All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. If you do have any questions, please do post it in the Q&A. We'll answer them shortly. But thank you very much for joining us this morning, Herman. Is there any last words you'd like to add before we end off the session?
Yeah, I think we're in the workman's compensation window to get all your your return of earnings in. We can gladly offer our assistance in those matters if there's any. I think there is a question on there. So yeah, if anybody needs any advice, you all can look us up, and we'll gladly assist on compensation matters. I think there's a question from Michael. It says, "Hi guys, what will happen if I got injury on duty but not intentional, and my boss takes me to the hospital for treatment, and after a week my boss tells me to pay the money back?" Right. So again, this will border on not legal. Number one, that should be registered whether it's intentional or not. It is an injury, and it should be sent through the compensation fund as an injury. So you would fill out all the necessary documents. In terms of the treatment, the company is in their rights to pay for the treatment. They can't ask the individual to pay back. What they should in that case do is get the case registered, submitted as a claim on Workman's Compensation. Look, even if this happened a while back, they can gladly do that now. They can submit the claim now, and the Workman's Compensation in this particular case will not compensate the medical provider, but rather compensate the individual that paid for it, and in this particular case will be the employer. I hope that answered your question, Michael.
All right, thank you very much. I don't think there
I
are
don't think
any
there's
other
any more
questions.
questions.
So we can end the session there. So thank you very much for joining us this morning, Herman. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for also joining us this morning. Just a quick reminder that there will be recording on the LMS system. That recording will be available from 12 o'clock today. Any last words from you, Herman?
No, that's it. Well, just thank you to you guys for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. And have a lovely week.
All right, take care. Bye.